Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to People Who Think. My name is Demetrias Wolverton, and I am the Mission Impact Manager for YWCA Kalamazoo. In honor of Black History Month, we have a great panel here for you today talking about queer people of color and their contributions to the civil rights movements and resistance, past, present, and future. Today we have Dr. Michelle Johnson, public scholar and co-founder and former executive director of Fire Historical and Cultural Arts Collaborative, a state historian with a focus on resistance across multiple identities, and also known as DJ Disobedience on the Flipback Soul Show on WIDI. Next to her, we have Reverend Dr. Joanne Mundy, who is the senior catalyst for Erase, which stands for Eliminating Racism and Celebrating and Creating Equity.
Yes, sir.
In addition to that, we have Natalie Nguyen, the Director of LGBT Student Services of Western Michigan University. Thanks so much for all tuning in. Today, I just want to go in and talk about some things, specifically the contributions that queer folks of color have made to history, specifically Black history, specifically resistance movements that have offered or has pressed forward resistance for communities. But however, they're oftentimes left out of the narrative. They're oftentimes not highlighted, or they are highlighted, but their queer identity is not. So what are some thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, as a historian and someone who's thought about this very deeply over a wide range of time, we know that there are lots of folks that we will probably never know about their contribution. When we look at the census data, they're probably going to be single teachers or social workers. We certainly know that a number of folks have never had the opportunity to be their full, authentic selves. But when we start to then look in the 1920s, particularly around the Harlem Renaissance, I think that is one of those real critical times when we can see more overt activism in ways, especially through the arts. You have people like Langston Hughes who, maybe wasn't completely out, but was able to speak forward. Wallace Thurman, certainly Bruce Nugent, folks that were kind of articulating even more clearly. But I think especially about the people, the Black folks in Harlem that were hosting these incredible parties and these events where, people who were very firmly gender nonconforming, perhaps not in their everyday life, but creating safe spaces for them to be themselves. And then that trajectory moving forward to people like Bayard Rustin, for instance, and Audre Lorde and James Baldwin, and the very people we have here in Kalamazoo and in the state of Michigan and nationally that have made an impact. So those roots are very deep, and I certainly wish that we could get even closer to the very deeper roots that we have. We know that there were people who were enslaved that were very likely very committed to one another, that were would probably not have identified as queer because it didn't quite mean what it means now. But yeah, I'm very much fascinated by those levels of histories in the multiple ways, especially through the arts, that we've claimed space and claimed our unique identities.
Why do you think it's the arts that queer folks of color gravitate to really create that change or to use as an act of resistance?
Well, I mean, the arts, after working with so many artists over decades now at this point, I mean, the arts, if you're going to really be a true artist, you have to articulate your authentic self, right? I mean, you can certainly be a repressed artist, but then you're not being your full self. You're not being able to lend the breadth and the depth of one's creative expression. And so I think once you tap into the need to express yourself creatively, then all of those other experiences, all those other backgrounds that you bring to the table, really have to come out in order to a full articulation of one's artistic expression. So I think then when you're dealing with, or you are living out your life as an artist, the rawness of who you are has to come forward, and then therefore we kind of create those spaces for folks to be their full selves.
The other thing that I would add to that, or shade it a little, is that the artistry allows a person and their identity to be nuanced and add tonal color and some shading, and broaden the scope and depth of what you are discovering as your own authentic and true self.
And this is not to say that the industry, the music
I'm
industry
not
or the
talking
art
about that.
industry,
No.
this is not where people oftentimes
No.
get to be their full, full
No.
self. And I mean, we can still see how many black lesbian women or queer women are still to this day not out. We got Kalani, she's not getting any radio play. Or, Sid the Kid from, in her work with internet, and, she gets a little radio play, or they get a little radio play, but we're still struggling.
You, Dr. Johnson, you mentioned Bayard Rustin, and that's like someone that in my social activism, that is someone that I look towards. Like that is like who set the precedent for someone like me, right? And that's what I try to press for. But to me, during the civil rights movement, Bayard and Dr. King kind of represent like this conflicting relationship between the church and the queer folks of color, and specifically how it's impacted and shaped agendas around black liberation. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Well, I'm just like, I had an opportunity to run into Reverend Dr. William Barber in an airport one day. And he is the founder or a founder of Moral Mondays.
No, he's the founder.
Okay. I didn't want to say it if it wasn't exactly right, Moral Mondays in North Carolina and the president of the NAACP for the state of North Carolina. And he is written a book, The Third Reconstruction, and he's talking about this period that we find ourselves in, and how are we going to bridge social justice and activism and what is happening in the church. And I am clear that Jesus would not have us scare the hell out of people, but love them into the kingdom, his kingdom, however you understand that. And so we have to find a way to walk and work together and not put people out of the family. And the family is much bigger than I can't believe I'm on television quoting scripture, but Jesus said, I have flocks of which you know not. That means some of us who think we know, we've been trained to our highest level of, there's stuff that we don't know. We ain't gonna find it by pushing people away. We have to be able to invite folk into conversation. So we should have relationships with people who are deeply in love with the church and deeply in love with Jesus, and people who are not. People who are humanist, people who are atheists and agnostic, people who are Wiccan. We should be able to have conversations with them because we all want the best for our families and our children. And we're not going to get there if we cannot have collective and cooperative and civil, humane conversations with one another.
And I know you were getting ready to say something. I want to say something, but please, say you go first because you haven't gotten to.
Yeah, so I want to say that Bayard Rustin at that time, homosexuality, and have to also understand that Bayard Rustin was targeted for multiple reasons, not just his sexual orientation, but also the fact that at the time, when he was in his younger years, he was tied to communism. He was tied to the Communist Party, and so it was a very deliberate, very intentional ways that either the media or those in power were trying to narrate the message of, well, this is about communism, it's about subversion, it's also about homosexuality, and then ensuring that certain folks weren't making an influence, right? Because that was also at a time where in the South, there was really much a scare to try to weed out faculty and professors and instructors who were LGBT and trying to tie them to communism instead, because they couldn't really nail them, so to speak, on these LGBT identities, right? So again, there are so many things at play there, and I definitely agree with bringing more folks in, because as someone who lived and worked in the South for 12 years and survived that, and who does not identify as a Christian. I was raised in Eastern religions. I was raised as a Buddhist, so it was very mind-altering and is a huge culture shock to be in communities that are so faith-based but rooted in faith that was not welcoming.
And kind of along those lines, I think that King had shortcomings, and one of those is that this was a person who knew biblical texts, inside and out, but at the same time, his pressure was not really because if you read the Bible, there are very few places where it says anything about, it says nothing about women really being together, and there are very few places where there are any kind of very strong words against men in same-sex relationships, and so. His pressure, I don't think, was necessarily a biblical one, although in black community, we still rely on this text that has been, is very colonial and has very much tried to remove us from our West African heritage that had nothing to do, or maybe minimally to do, with these traditions. And so his pressure, I don't think, was his understanding of this biblical text, because if he was coming from that perspective, there's very little to kind of argue against, in this case, same-sex relationships. His pressure came from his own homophobia, homophobia in the black community that was existent and in still many ways that continues to exist. So, I mean, I think he had some significant shortcomings in that way as a scholar, as a biblical scholar, because he had, I think, a responsibility as someone who put himself forward as knowing this really iconic text to take stronger positions. And I'm so happy that his wife, Coretta Scott King, then later corrected some of his mistakes by coming forward and saying very clearly that these are intersecting issues. When King was blind to it and it gave in to significant pressure.
And then again, we have women of color carrying that plight and pressing that forward. But that's a whole nother conversation. Tune in to March, right? We talked a lot about working together and what that looks like. And so, what does an inclusive agenda look like for liberation of folks of color? How do we incorporate these identities or these intersectionalities? How do we incorporate those things into our agenda where people can still hold true to other values and beliefs that they have?
Well, I think something in that, like when you brought up earlier about the civil rights and other folks, some things that came to mind were other Asian Americans who were involved in the civil rights movement, but who did not identify as LGBT, right? Like Yuri Kochiyama was like the best friend of Malcolm X. Richard Aoki, one of the only Asians to be part of the Black Panther Party. Grace Lee Boggs, who has Michigan ties, who died a couple years ago and lived to be 100 years old. So understanding, they understood, they knew, like, there was very conscientious discussions. Like, Yuri had conversations with Black civil rights leaders, and some of them said, you need to speak up a little bit more. And she's like, I don't want to take away the narrative or the voice from Black folks who are actually experiencing this. But she also understood, like, her role as an Asian American woman, who survived Japanese internment, that she had a perspective, and that she experienced how the narratives changed around Asian Americans and how that could be easily manipulated for Black folks and African Americans and any communities of color, right? So understanding that, having those conversations, but also, again, still being welcoming, but also giving grace to those that, I always say to myself that I'm still learning. I may say things, I still consider myself there's a difference between like an ally, an advocate, and somebody who's an accomplice for social justice. And I try to consider myself as an accomplice or an advocate, but I also know that there's still work to be done, and that I'm not perfect in that. And so we got to continue having those conversations, and I got to continue having, good folks these folks here checking me and like, Natalie, you said something, but you left out this, or this didn't quite sound right. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like being able to learn from that and continue moving forward.
I think there's something about us developing the capacity to hear other people's stories. So if we don't know what Japanese internment is, or we don't know what the Indian Removal Act is, if we don't know about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, what Mexico loses 525,000 square miles as a part of this treaty, and the treaty says that they can keep their language and their culture, and yet that is not a thing that exists. Until we begin to understand that everybody got some kind of migration, displacement, colonial, capitalistic story, then we think our story is the center story, knowing that it's, you know, so we're all engaged in the transformation of the supremacy of whiteness. And that is like everywhere. And until we understand that a solution that might work for African American people may not be the solution that will work for Asian American people, or a solution that will work for Latinx folk, certainly will not be a solution that will work for Native American folk. Until we can hear that and figure out how we can do more than one thing at a time, we're going to be caught in what we sometimes call the oppression Olympics.
Yep.
And you know, who wants to win gold medal in that, right? So we have to make room to just be with each other and hear.
I have a follow-up question. You talk about the...
Can I add something to that? Because one of the things that Joanne was talking about is kind of that the multiplicity of experience and being able to understand all of that. And, you know, intersectionality is like the new buzzword now. But, you know, people like Audre Lorde, who I'd had the, you know, the honor to meet and have conversation with on at least a couple of occasions in my undergrad and graduate life, you know, she was like, for me, the, you know, the epitome of articulating the importance of the intersectionality before they were calling it intersectionality. She said, I'm a mother, I'm a black woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm a poet, I'm an activist, and you cannot separate out any of those pieces. And so the degree to which our social justice movement is going to be successful is the degree to which when we understand our own intersectionality and our own relationship to place and space, so that we have to always be thinking about, you know, what we eat, where we live. And so when we think about where we live, we know we are on Native people's land right this moment. And so if we are on Native people's lands right this moment, we have a responsibility to understand that and take action in our daily life. We are on land, so we need to be thinking about our plastic bottles and the way we impact the planet, the way that, you know, the things that we eat, or the beings that we eat and call things, right? Then what is the impact on the planet? What is the impact? If we're standing up for if we're taking a nonviolent stance in our social justice movement, that comes down to the very way that we live, so that the personal is political in that way. And so we have to take the responsibility of our intersectional position on the planet in relationship to others, because everything we do, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the cars we drive, the things we watch on television, the subscriptions we have, you know, do we get our stuff from do we getting our books from Amazon? These all have an impact. And so dealing with that, we have to deal with that as Black people, and we don't often want to do that.
So going beyond salient identities and incorporating other things such as environmental justice and things like that.
Yes.
I do have a follow-up question for you, Joanne, excuse me, Dr. Mundy, because you talk about the oppression Olympics, and that's often something that I wrestle with when I have conversations with a lot of individuals, because although different groups who identify as people of color have been displaced and colonialized and all those different things, does the system impact them the same? And is there groups of people who are severely impacted by these structural systems more than others?
So, you know, when I hear Michelle, Dr. Johnson, demonstrate academic acumen as they just did, right? You cannot help but understand that systemic and structural racism and oppression impacts different people in different ways, at different times, to different degrees.
And it also depends on who's in power and privilege to make those intentional messages that narrate how people view things and experience things, right?
So whichever identity someone might see me, Joanne Mundy, in at a given moment, you know, I say that I've been educated to my highest level of incompetency. You know, so like, I have 14 years of postgraduate education. It's not that I'm smart. I can like produce grades. So that does provide me with some access. And yet, on occasion, that we can't quantify the harm that is coming to me or I feel as greater than the harm that is coming to someone else or that they may feel. So then the point becomes to me, how do we hear one another? And how do we figure out what it means to be in solidarity with one another? And I know that sometimes I have to put my desires, wants, maybe even needs in a submitted or submissive position to someone else's for a time in order for us all to get what we need to get.
So the question I have is, do you feel as if there are some systematic things that have to be changed first in order for folks to be in solidarity? Because when we talk about like I feel and things like that, and some people's experiences are direct byproduct of the system, right? You know, we've seen it multiple times in history, how, you know, specifically in the feminist movement or women, you know, white women was like, we'll go first, and women of color, we'll come back for y'all, you know, and that didn't come back, and they haven't came back, right? However,
but who's to say
if I'm just posing a question, if white women have not gone first and moved some of those different barriers that are specifically related to gender and not gender and gender identity and race, but just specifically on the premise of being a woman, do you think women of color would have been able to reach those?
Come on now. Come on now.
I'm just asking the question.
I know you stirring up trouble. That's what you're doing.
So this question is very much kind of like the chicken and egg argument. Which comes first? And in actuality, it shouldn't have to.
It has to be simultaneous.
It does. It has to be a multi-pronged approach. And the ultimate reality is, like, we have this hindsight 2020 thing about the women's movement, which is great. But like it still comes back to, are we actually listening to each other? Are we actually making it a multifaceted platform? Are we addressing things in a multifaceted way, right? Because the way you know, you address a message may be different from the way I address a message. And we also have to look at the systemic issues. So going back to your earlier question, like the systemic issues that affected like Asian Americans, which is why Asian Americans during the civil rights and during the LGBT movement took a back seat, is because we have to acknowledge that pre-1965, the Immigration Act was a quota system. So a way to filter out the undesirable folks was sexual orientation. And then on top of that, after World War II, they had the whole model minority myth that they created in order to assimilate Japanese folks back into American culture and into white assimilation and that middle classism and that sort of thing, but also to differentiate the Chinese Americans from the Japanese Americans, saying that, you know, the Chinese Americans at the time were this model minority, that they were great, they're good folks, as opposed to the Japanese Americans, well, you can't trust them. And then afterwards that changed again, right? So you have to, and here's the other fun part that not a lot of civil rights folks know about, is that during the Japanese internment, you know, before that, the Japanese folks were the epitome of like model citizens and business owners and that sort of thing. But because they were, you know, put in these, for lack of better terms, internment camps, concentration camps, etc., that they started influencing culture in different ways. They started looking for cultural ways of belonging. They looked for that from Latinx and Black communities. And so again, the government and these folks that were in charge of these camps are saying, no, we can't have that. We cannot have like this further growth of this community, right?
So it brings to mind another way we nuance this work sometimes. So I always say, when asked with this kind of question, who come on, just admit that somebody has it worse sometime. Yes, and. So I say, somebody has it worse, and in my case, black folks got it worse, and we're trying to get somewhere, and there's anti-black sentiment.
Yes.
And I said this out loud to my Native American boss, who is a wonderful person. And they said to me, yes, and there's anti-Indian sentiment also. And there's anti-Asian sentiment also.
Right,
Like,
but we're not talking about presidents. We're talking about specific systematic things,
and
right?
This is I think if we look at systemic issues through a lens of sustainability, another buzzword now. But when we think about sustainability, quite often we're talking about environmental sustainability. But if we put everything through the lens, to me, of what is like the seven generation test, right? If what we're doing, can this last for seven generations? And if it does last for 7 generations, what is the impact going to be? And we can bring that to every single issue, and that then is going to make it. And when if it's not going to, we're not going to endure. We're not going to thrive in those 7 generations. We need to stop that stuff right now. And so the environmental issues, then we're going to have to think about those and the ways in which the landfill in Detroit is on the east side of Detroit, right? The incinerator, and it is spewing out toxins over and over again, and has been for decades in black communities. And so we have to deal with the intersection of race and environment and the things that we consume and how much we consume and where we decide to dump them. And so all of those issues, like if we look through the lens of sustainability for all of our systems, then we are ultimately going to have to come up with new solutions. And that's we have like hundreds of years of new solutions, of solutions that are applicable to creating a more sustainable world. So for me, the lens is always that lens of sustainability. And that's what makes me queer, right? It's not just my sexuality, it's how my relationship to capitalism. It's my relationship to what I consume. It's my relationship to gender nonconformity. That's what makes me queer, not who I sleep with. That's part of it, right? But it's only a piece.
It's only a small part.
Sometimes bigger than
well,
others.
I can't say that. I'm just saying it's political. It is actually, it is my
Everything
relationship.
is political.
It is my
Absolutely.
relationship to who I am and how I'm going to live in this world. I am not going to live in this world in the same way that some other folks have historically, and the best place I can anchor that for Joanne is about queer. Gender nonconforming and will not. I'm not going to be pressed into. And there's a lot of people who are saying, no, we're not going to be pressed into. We're just not going to do that.
Thanks for sharing. Thanks so much for tuning in to Our People Who Think. Again, if you do not follow us on Facebook or Twitter, you can follow us at YWCA KZoo. Thanks so much, and see you next month.
I thought they were giving us the go on sign.